test of what's difficult. Y'all are welcome to go ahead and have a seat. Yes. We're going to start, we're talking about guns, and out on the street, if you ask people, if you say guns, everybody frames that lights up a whole bunch of different things to different people. So if you feel that there's a problem, or if you feel that, whatever you feel about guns, I would love to know that. And if there is a solution or a way forward, I just want to cut to the chase. I mean, we might not need any more questions. I'd love to hear about a solution that you think is the most actionable, the most important thing that we should be focused on right now and helping us to frame this conversation and get it started. You've got the microphone, Marissa. If you would like to start us out, remember we've got 2 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, and let me congratulate you all for getting together on these tough issues, because I think that's part of the solution to the issue. Hello, can you hear me? Better? Okay, so I just used up 15 seconds. Let me frame this from my perspective as a physician and a public health physician specifically. That let's go back to 2017, just after the Las Vegas massacre. NBC News ran an article after they looked at the CDC's data on firearm discharge deaths, and they compared it to all the deaths of our military folks from the inception of our country. And guess what? Since 1968, more people have died from non-war firearm deaths than all of those wars. That's really chilling to me. But let me bring it closer to home. Right here, within a mile of this site, since 2014, there have been 26 shootings, 9 fatalities, right here within a mile. So we're approaching in our country almost 40,000 deaths from firearm discharges. One thing that's really critical to think about is that 60% of those are suicides. So we have many issues here. And I think the question I would ask to the group, maybe you'll ask me more, is whether or not you think this is a public health issue. Because one of the solutions, if it's a public health issue, is to deal with it as a public health issue. And I'll be happy to expand on that, but let me just say, we have some really good examples. We can take what we did with motor vehicle-related deaths in the 60s, and we can build on that. Because there were some very smart people at the time who took a very comprehensive view of that, and I'll be happy to expand on that.
Thank you very much.
Great question. It goes to the core of the issue, and I agree with the doctor on this reality. I don't think guns, the problem we perceive with guns in this country is a real gun issue. There's elements of that. The larger issue is mental health. And without addressing mental health, we're dealing with a symptom, not the problem. And I'll share with you this. We all love art, right? But not one of us can tell you the brush that was used by Rembrandt. None of us can tell the typewriter style that was used by F. Scott Fitzgerald. None of us can tell the pen that was used by Hemingway or Mark Twain. The reality is it's not the instrument, it's the person. So unless we deal with the people, the cause of the problem, she's exactly right about the statistics on suicide. It's an enormous problem. That's the mental health part of the problem. But that's not the only part. We deal with the criminal justice part of the issue. And that is the part that is gang violence in our inner cities. 54% of the counties in the United States have not had one fatality in the last calendar year. 54% of the counties through gun violence. More importantly, of that, the reality is most of the gun violence in this country is very predictable. We know where it is, and we know what the causal relationships are. And there are really 4 major things, particularly related to mass shooting, because that's where this will end up, is talk about mass shootings. These people are identifiable. Our failure to identify them is our fault. In fact, the Parkland shooter, we can go on and on about how we can identify who these people are in our communities. The problem is we have not put in the recipe of identifying these people in advance. That is the end. We want to lower the incidence of those type of causal problems. But again, it'll move into a major issue, and that is going to be whether we're going to ban guns, correct? So let's think about that for a second. If 3% of those guns or rifles or those types of weapons are part of the crime problem, why are we focusing on 3% of the problem as opposed to the 97%? That 97% is handguns. That is the issue. Are you looking to ban handguns? I don't think so, but you might be. This might be like some of the other political issues out there.
Thank you. Great comments by both speakers. So I come at this as a clinical psychologist. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist. I'm a professor at USF in the psychology department. And my area of research actually is on violence and criminal behavior. So I have some familiarity with folks who may commit these kinds of crimes. And I agree with the previous speaker that mass shootings are really such a small percentage that if we focus on that, we miss the larger issue. So I can address a little bit the issues of mental health. Suicide being kind of the major issue that we should focus on when it comes to mental health. And one of the ways as clinical psychologists that we work with people who have suicide risk, and this is where I differ from the previous speaker, is means reduction or means, so basically if a person says that they've used medication to overdose, we work with them to reduce their access to those. The same thing with guns. And guns, there is no second chance. Most people who engage in suicide attempts, who use another method, hanging or drugs overdose, they survive 90% of the time. Those who use a gun, they die 90% of the time. Most of those people who survive a suicide attempt never try again. Guns do not allow you that second chance. And this is why guns restrictions for people who are suicidal is important. Now, the other aspects of gun violence that are non-suicide, mental health is not the issue. It never has been. Okay, so just want the facts out there.
Okay. I didn't hear many solutions in that, so hopefully we're going to get to this. Okay? Yeah. Do y'all think we should give them 20 seconds each to give me a solution? Sure. 20 seconds?
Sure. We need more community policing in our cities. With gang violence is the largest predominant reason of gun violence in America. It is it. So we need to put the resources where they're required. On the mental health side, think about this. In 1960 or thereabout, we had about 500,000 people in mental health institutions, committed people. Today we have about 25,000. We have twice as many people today. We're not dealing with the mental health causes. We're micro-targeting instead of macro-targeting.
Thank you.
So the solution will require us to focus on people, on the agent of issue, the guns, and the environment that it occurs in. This is how we take a public health problem and we deal with it. And we've been very successful when we work together that way and make sure that every approach that we've taken considers all three. So I disagree that the only answer is mental health. It's not. In fact, if we only focus on mental health, we're going to miss much of the other issues. And as you heard, suicide, you don't get a second chance if there's a gun involved. And many of those people are looking for health. So we need to consider all three.
So all solutions, no solution is all kinds of violence, including gun violence. One major one that we can do right now, and it has been empirically proven to work, is comprehensive background checks. And that hasn't been passed at the federal level because at the state level, many states have had that. And what happens? Across the board, states have seen decreases, especially in suicide deaths, as well as homicides.
Thank you. We're going to start with our member questions. If you would, introduce yourself, and remember, we're asking a question. Kathy, behave yourself.
Kathy Betancourt, you mentioned background checks. We have the state, we have the feds, and we have local government. I would like each one of you to tell me, you've already mentioned one thing, what you think cities and counties, local government can do, what you think the state can do, and what you think the feds can do. And part of the has to do with, you could go to a subset of that. The feds have disallowed research on gun violence. What research would you make part of that? So state, local, fed.
Thank you.
So But let me start with the Fed because research is critical. You can't solve a public health issue unless you have good data, and we are hamstrung in terms of data. So we definitely need to make changes at the federal level to make sure that we have the data that we need. We could have not made any of the strides on automobile deaths, and nobody talked about taking away automobiles at that point, if we didn't have good data. So good data is critical, and then states and localities need to act on that data. So convenings at the local level are really critical to understand what's happening in your neighborhood and taking that data and making it actionable, and states need to support the localities to do that type of approach.
On the state level, there is that Florida has seen, and most states who have this, concealed carry permits have actually decreased violent crime, the use of handguns and violent crime. That's a noticeable statistic, and we know that not only here, we know that all around the country. Vermont, for instance, has very little legal restrictions on their residents with handguns, and they have very little violent crime. So we also, some of the research we have to point out is that if we know where the identifiable places where crime is more likely, we need to allocate our resources. So both on the local and state level, law enforcement has to be spending more time in those areas. I can give you an example of a church in South County. They have a law enforcement officer undercover on the campus because they know it's a known target. The reality is our schools are certain targets, but not the only targets. We have targets that are identifiable, and we have the victim or the causalities that we know where they are. We just have to be cognizant. In schools, we need to have mental health screening. We need to do a better job of identifying the risk before they become threats.
Thank you.
So, as I mentioned, at the federal level, we need to have those legislation that cuts across states. A lot of pro-gun groups, and again, I'm pro-Second Amendment. I do not think that people's guns should be taken away for no reason, but it's clear that that the guns that are used in a lot of these areas that the previous speaker mentions come from neighboring states that have very lax gun laws. I don't know what data he's using, but as a psychologist, I look at the data, and all the states, the laxest gun regulations are the ones with the highest gun violence. So his data is not accurate, and I could tell you because I can send you each and every article, including a meta-analysis that looked at all the articles that have been published and found that to be conclusive.
Any rebuttal on the panel? 30 seconds?
Sure.
It seemed like there was.
Actually, Vermont, Idaho, New Hampshire, Oregon, they defy your statistics that you put out there. You can look for it yourself. It's very easily findable. So you admit that it defies your statistical analysis?
It's 5 states. I'm talking about generalizable data. You're talking about states that have people who hunt. Those are not, and that have like 20,000 people in them. That's not generalizable data. I'm a researcher. I understand methodology, and I can tell you that a meta-analysis of studies that have looked at various states geographically dispersed find something completely opposite. But you're
going to move on. Thank you.
okay. Thank you.
Richard Stein. This question is directed to the gentleman up there. Why is it necessary for non-military citizens to have access to assault-style weapons?
Great question. Well, first of all, the Constitution kind of tells us that. Do you believe it? No, it's actually derived the Constitution, correct? That's a small little point to point out here. The fact is, the Second Amendment does not specialize. It doesn't talk about whether you have an AR-15. It doesn't matter if you have a musket. It doesn't matter if you have a revolver or a pistol or a Glock. The fact is, you have an undeniable right, and it's not a right from government. You understand that the Bill of Rights are protections of your rights against the government, not protections of, not issuance of rights for the individual. That's the fact. The reality is, when we look at the weapon is not the issue within the Second Amendment. It's the right of the citizen to bear arms. Why? Because our founders just came out of defending their lives against tyranny.
Any other responses from the panel?
So we need to evolve with the times. When the data, and I would ask you, what do we care about as a society? Do we care about making sure that our children can grow and live and thrive in our societies? Right now we have a burden of adverse childhood experiences that leaves children tainted and sets them on terrible pathways in life if they make it that far. But we have segments of the population who aren't even living that long. So as a society, what is it that we care about, and then what are we willing to do about it? I agree, I certainly uphold rights, but law evolves with the times, and over the years, we've implemented public health actions over and above laws, and fortunately, not often, but take away rights when we need to protect the public's well-being. We need to have deeper dialogue about this.
Thank you. And I'd like to comment on the constitutional issue because I don't know if you are, but I'm assuming not, because most courts have upheld bans on assault weapons. So constitutionally, and if you look at the Heller decision by Scalia, he wrote that there are that decision did not abrogate the right of local governments to restrict and regulate guns. So there is no constitutional issue. You're on very shaky ground because even conservatives do not agree with you.
30-second response on that, please.
Well, the animosity aside, the reality is, yes, the Constitution does. And the fact is, Judge Scalia reaffirmed this, and so did the Supreme Court, and that is, the Constitution is only against the federal government, not against the states. The states are free to regulate as they wish based on their constitutions that do not violate the tenets of the federal Constitution. The states can regulate many things that the federal government cannot. The Second Amendment was explicit.
Thank you. We are moving on.
Hi, I'm Jean Iglesias. I find it sometimes disingenuous, the argument to be that the people want to ban guns. Just because you want to have regulations like we do for cars and other safety issues, no one is talking about bans. The other thing I find disingenuous that I'd like you to address is the line that's in the Second Amendment that says a well-regulated militia. And that is never brought up, and a militia in those days ended up becoming our police force. But it definitely says well-regulated, so I never understand the argument of saying we shouldn't regulate. And the issues, mental health, well, how do you defend that you leave out the line of well-regulated when we're just trying to ban weapons that are used in battle and things of that nature?
The best place to go is to probably the founders to one place to go, and actually it specifically states this, the title of his pamphlet on the subject was, What is the Militia? And that was by George Mason. George Mason was pretty explicit. Another place to go, you could look to the initial Tennessee Constitution. They described it somewhat. The fact is, a militia at the time was all the people of the community, all the people. And everyone was supposed to own arms. In fact, that was part of the requirement in the colonies for people to own arms. Why? Because they knew that there was not going to be a standing army all the time to deal with the problems they faced. The fact is, the militias of all the people. Now, can we agree that where we should probably learn gun safety is in our schools? It's a fundamental right of the American people to own guns. So it should be a fundamental requirement of education to teach people about guns and gun safety. Certain problems we face in society. But a militia is not what you believe today to be the National Guard. The militia was the everyday citizens.
Any responses from the panel?
So I have to wonder if there's some deeper issues here. Are we a society that doesn't trust one another? Are the issues that existed when the nation was founded the same issues as of today? And I think I dive because we're not as well connected as society and communities as we could be. We don't necessarily know our neighbors. And and separation, which is, I think, foundational in terms of our ability to trust one another. I think guns is a vehicle to utilize when you fear for your life. And if we live in societies where fear is enhanced, is extreme, then perhaps we need guns. The question I would ask is, can we create a society where we don't have that same need?
Anything? We're going to move on.
Okay.
Hi there. I'm Michael Isaac. This is actually the first time I've asked a question. From the question is the impact that the internet may have on this. And the platform from the internet allows someone to go from anonymity to infamy in a split second. And as a platform, I think it gives someone who is who would otherwise be isolated an opportunity to sit there behind a keyboard and get radicalized. So if we're not going to talk about the impact that the internet has, I think we're missing a key aspect to the, well, I want their opinion.
Okay, thank you.
That's a really good question, and we have seen that type of radicalization in terms of white supremacy in the recent mass shootings. And one of the things that I think works is they did this in terms of reporting of suicide, and I'm not sure why it isn't being done by the media in terms of reporting of mass shootings, is that there are guidelines, media guidelines, because they found that depending on how the media reported suicide, there was contagion effects. And that needs to be done. There's this very good initiative now by one of the by the survivors, parent survivors of one of the mass shootings. It's called No Notoriety. So spending very little time either mentioning the name or talking about the background of the shooter. There is no need. There are criminologists and other people who are going to understand and study them. There's no need for the general public to study them and to understand them. So that's one major way to reduce this contagion effect.
Thank you.
So I want to second the social contagion concern. Evidence that that's an issue, and that's going to require a concerted effort by all of us to rethink, particularly for our children, how do we assure their safety and their mental health. And I'm going to add that there's another concern here, because if you look at the data that we do have, there are significant increases since the early 2010s, 2012, in a number of things, not only gun violence, you know about addiction, particularly the opioid addiction. We even have increases in motor vehicle crashes with distracted drivers. So the question I think we need to ask ourselves is, how do we make sure that we're not creating an addicted community, and particularly young people, children, adolescents, whose brains are still developing are at great risk. So issues like connection to the internet are really critical for young folks. And I think we all have an obligation as a society and as communities to protect our children from those forces.
Question, because, and I agree with the other panelists, non-notoriety is a key element to this. The fact is that nearly one identifiable reality for all the mass killings is that they do research. They pre-plan. And one thing they want to do is they want that notoriety. They want that acclaim. That's part of their goal, and that's why they do the targeting that they do. And the research, that's an absolute fact from the research. Additionally, 60% of them we have found had mental health issues. So if we did identify them through the system, and here's the thing, what I'm advocating, part of the solution process, is advancing and adding to our both state, federal, and national expenditures towards mental health, because we need to identify these people. The 4 characteristics that identify mass shooters are mental health issues, schizophrenia, sociopath, psychopath, and then near trauma to their lives recent from the occurrence of the event. Within the go into these outcomes. If we can help identify these people, we can help reduce the violence.
Thank you.
I'm Mimi Osias, and I apologize, I did not get your names, but the lady in the middle spoke about the lack of data. And so I would like to ask the man on the end, what, if any, objection you have to a federal study of what the real problems are. You seem to say it's only mental health. And if it is only mental health, how much money are you willing to pay in taxes for?
Did not say it was only mental. They're identifiable causes, and one of them is, the largest one is actually gang of suicide. So suicide, if we know 60% of the killings of the 35,000 a year are suicide, mental health is the largest component of that, correct? Yes. So then we look to what are the other components? Well, gang violence is the next biggest component. And I already gave you the statistic, 54% of the counties didn't experience one homicide due to guns in our nation. So we can micro-target in a better way. And yes, on the state and federal and national level, we should be increasing our expenditures for mental health research, but not just the research, but targeting. We need to get in the schools. And Dr. Woodson, you may remember him, Mr. Lewis passed away yesterday, God bless him. Woodson was also a civil rights activist from Philadelphia, inner city Philadelphia. He started the Woodson Center in Ohio. He has a prescription of about 30 items, but we have to target these kids in the schools. We educate them on gun violence, we educate them on gun safety, and we identify them using their peers.
Research, because, as I mentioned before, it's not just about the people, and I'm concerned if we only focus on mental health. It's about the guns, and there are issues. I mean, if you don't want to take away guns, there are gun technologies for safer gun use. And then there's the environment. And we actually know through research and activities that are happening in communities right now that if you micro-target these areas and you clean them up, if you make them attractive, it makes a difference with the kind of violence that we're seeing. But my point is we need to look at all three, not only individually, but together. And that's the kind of research that we need. Type of research, and as a public health agency, they play a critical role.
Wanna take that? No? Okay, coming right back here.
Thank you. I'm sorry I didn't get your names either. I'll read back. The gentleman all the way to my left, Tom, are you a lawyer?
No, I'm not.
Okay, I am, and a constitutional lawyer. And I want to point no constitutional rights are without limitation. Just as you cannot scream fire in a crowded theater, amendment. So I ask your response to the fact, you made a statement that we can't regulate because of the Second Amendment. I believe that is not true, and I believe that you're not an expert in that regard. So assuming that we can do regulation, what regulation would you accept?
On the federal level, no regulation. On the state level, let the states decide what fits within their constitution. It's a very simple, we have a federal system, and while you're an attorney, trust me, I've spent a lot of time doing it for 35 years. But the fact is, that's why we have the federal system. States are the incubators of ideas. The federal government, the Bill of Rights, and I think you'll agree with me, is not a distribution of rights from the government to the people, correct? Yes? Okay, so it's a protection of rights against the government. There are no regulations. The Second Amendment. The Second Amendment is specific. States have the power. The states, well, maybe you need to go on one more time and understand that federal system abrogates to the states, gives the states the powers to do these things, and that's why each state has its own constitution, and it gets to choose what it does.
Any responses? You would introduce yourself, please.
Hi, everybody. I'm John Godwin. I work for the U.S. intelligence community, and I'm a lead analyst for SOCOM and CENTCOM. You mentioned before, Tom, that one of the core points of the Second Amendment was that it was basically a universal military because we didn't have a standing army. Now that we do have a standing army, and it's the strongest standing army in the history of the world, is the Second Amendment at all applicable? And if we still need that standing or that universal military, does that mean that citizens should also own RPGs and tanks?
Thank you.
To the last part, no. We're well understood to be arms of this kind. But here's the more important issue, and to the first part of your question is, it's more important today. Hitler rose from the Weimar Republic. We are a republic. Hugo Chavez this happens repeatedly. Now, it didn't happen in Cuba from a free nation, but the first thing these nations do is go to register guns and then restrict guns and then to confiscate guns. That's what tyranny does. The larger the military, the more threat upon the natural citizen. That's what our founders understood. It doesn't take much. In the Declaration of Independence, it was the natural rights that we have, those inalienable rights, and individually have that right.
So we have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, except that some 40,000 of our citizens don't even make it that far. I think it's time for us to take a deeper look.
Hi, Ben Ritter. If the United States government can forbid the sale of automatic weapons as they did in 1986 when the McClure-VOLKMER Act was passed, Fire Owners Protection Act of 1986, why can't the federal government forbid the sale of AR-15s and AK-45s?
The rationale was that an automatic weapon was a weapon of war, vis-a-vis a weapon of protection, and that was the distinction. If you read the full rationale behind it, it's about the protection of the individual. It's understood that, and even today, look at the amendment that we're looking at potentially here in Florida. The problem is automatic to semi-automatic. We're talking about the difference between people being able to protect themselves and a weapon of war. And we can agree that weapons of war shouldn't be in the hands of everybody, but the weapon of safety should be. In fact, the reality is, it was mentioned up here earlier, most incidents of weapon use in America is for protection. Far in excess, hundreds of thousands of efforts to protect yourself with weapons. But you don't ever see those statistics because it doesn't serve the media's handguns, and many of them are women, unfortunately.
I see you. I got lots. I'm coming to you, I promise. Any other responses there?
The statistics on women is that if there is a gun in the home, in times of conflict, likely to be killed. Women who, including with their own weapon, again, we have to look at the data instead of looking at anecdotal evidence or whatever, and the data are out there. And so the data suggests that most persons, especially women who have a firearm in the home, are much more likely to be killed by it than to protect themselves by it.
One other important point is that as a country, we're a clear outlier of death from firearm discharges. We have about a 25-time increased likelihood of death in the United States over any other developed country, and about an 8-time increase with respect to suicide, because as was mentioned, you don't get a second chance when there's a gun involved. So is that where we want to be as a country?
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Corwin. I have a question for Tom. I'm a little confused. You've said that we should be teaching in how to use guns, but doesn't that mean that people in gangs will just be better shots?
Gun safety is the prime. And keep in mind, this would be a high school level probably class, and most of those gang members have chosen to already leave the educational system. That's one of the problems we have in our inner cities and the poverty we have in these situations. But safety, how can safety be a bad thing? I'm just confused by your statement. So you're suggesting Teaching people how to use guns safely can make them marksmen or make them kill each other. Bad situation in America's inner cities. A black male black male is 50% more likely to be killed than a white male. That's scary, but it's even bigger than that. It's broader than that. Talk about the American family. Here is the ultimate statistic that should scare us all. The level of fathers outside of the household. You want to track criminal behavior in America, you track the breaking up of the American family, and they parallel each other dramatically. But what's remarkable, here's the remarkable part. Double the number of guns since 1993, and we have less than half the number of gun incidents in murder.
On all of the factors that lead to the statistics that he just quoted.
Diane, you make a note of this?
Yeah, because we as communities have really structural issues that have led to so much of what we're talking about today. And if we don't collectively deal with those and increase the opportunity for all people to have or the opportunity that only a segment of the population has now, we will continue to see this significant disparity. And there is a disparity in gun deaths, but it's not, and the answer is not guns. The answer is not more guns. The answer is not gun safety.
I know you got an answer on this one.
Well, one thing I'm going to say is that Tom is right that the crime rate has gone down incredibly since its peak in the 90s. And there are various reasons for that. I think the availability of guns is not one of them, and it has been proven not to be one of them. But here's the interesting statistics. Despite that decrease, there has been an increase in people's beliefs that they are unsafe. And that often promotes gun safety. The moment that somebody feels unsafe, and actually I do a lot of research on experiences of fear and violence that is promoted by fear, and that is a very strong motivator of aggression, is when one feels fearful. And having a gun makes sure that somebody else is going to die when one person feels fearful. And that's not the way to run this country. I agree with you. There's something inherently wrong with as much fear as people are experiencing right now.
Thank you.
Gary Dalgen, as a lawyer and someone who's running for judge, we're bound by United States Supreme Court precedent. And so I was just looking at Justice Scalia's opinion, which says the Second Amendment is not unlimited, and courts have routinely explained that the right was not a right to keep and carry any weapon whatsoever manner. And he talks about how you can make reasonable regulations. So my question to the panel is, what are reasonable regulations that could be made, but at the same time protecting a citizen's right under the Second Amendment?
We need good research. We need research to be able to inform the regulations. And that's in a functional society, that's exactly how it should work. That what actually is happening on the ground informs our decisions, that we have an evaluation process. We tweak those regulations as we need to meet the need. So I think it starts with good data to make good regulation.
I think we've been long had discussions about bump stocks. That's very reasonable. The reality is, regulations on guns will never stop criminals from accessing guns. Look at Chicago, look at Detroit, or Washington, D.C. The fact remains that guns are a tool. More people are killed by knives than AR-15s. That's just a fact. These are statistical facts. The reality is, and you're exactly right about the scare factor that's going on. This 24/7 news cycle frightens kids. A friend of mine in Orlando, her daughter she's very much against guns, but they have to do these exercises three times a year about mass gun shooter exercises. Of course that's going to scare people. Of course that's going to hardening these soft targets would be something that, and dealing with mental health concerns in these places, putting a law enforcement officer or a school marshal in the program in place are sensible solutions that have proved to work elsewhere.
I agree that more research is needed by the CDC and other federal agencies. At the same time, there's a lot of independent researchers who have conducted the research. And although we can't do we can't do an experiment where we randomly assign states to different conditions of you get a lot of guns, you don't get a lot of guns. There are natural experiments out there where there have been states that have shifted their laws one way or the other and states that have shifted it another direction, and the data are clear. Comprehensive background checks and red flag laws do reduce deaths from gun violence, especially suicide. So these are reasonable regulations that have been passed at the federal level, and I should say federal courts have upheld bans on assault weapons. So federal judges, again, disagree with your statement that at the federal level we can't have regulation.
Thank you. 30 seconds,
Okay,
please.
the federal judges who've ruled on this are ruling on state laws. This is a very simple concept. The states can regulate these instruments. And they do, and they have, and that's why it's been upheld. It's not the federal government that has issued this edict from the Congress of the United States.
Do you want to respond?
Yeah. Except 1994, there was the assault weapons ban that wasn't challenged.
My name is Sally Cruz. I want to tell you I'm also a single mother, and this is one of my kids I raised. I kind of resent you giving it to the people that didn't have your so-called family together, that we caused all this. My other question is, can you explain to me what use is an assault weapon to your average Joe, and why do I need one in the house? And tell me what legally they're used for.
All right, first of all, I did not insult you or single moms. In fact, just the opposite. I did not. I said, this is a statistic. The statistic is not pejorative. The statistic suggests that it's one of the most identifiable causalities to crime in America is single-parent households that are led by women. That's just a fact. That's not a pejorative. I'm not disparaging women. In fact, I came from see a home has two parents in it. That's better for the child. Statistically speaking, we know this is the case. Is it not? Is it always the case? Of course not. Nothing's absolute. Now, to your second point is, on an AR-15 in your home, don't.
My question is, what is it used for?
If you'd like me to shoot me an email and show you all the cases where AR-15 was used, if you would like an email and give you an example of
Can you
where
give us one?
AR-15 was used to protect a female in a home invasion or such, I can do that. It's happened time and time and time again. In fact, as I said, the statistics are in excess where guns are used to protect people.
Any responses? No?
Hi there, Deborah Belanti. First off, I'm a mom of a child in elementary school, and I don't want guns anywhere near her, so thank you. But my question to you is this. I believe this is an epidemic. And like our opioid epidemic across our nation, which we're not blaming the people taking the drugs, we're blaming the drug, and we're going after pharmaceutical companies. Why are we not addressing this as the same way?
I'm wondering the same question. It's just a matter of time. So, and when will the American people get fed up? Because you know there are laws in place protecting gun manufacturers in ways that don't protect other manufacturers who are at risk of issues such as producing opioids. So if we were going to deal with this as a public health issue, then we would deal with all of these aspects, and we would have a better understanding of who causes what, and where our best investment dollars would be to impact the issue.
Other responses?
Well, a lot to unpack there, but the reality is the statistics, research it yourself. It's a very simple statistic. 54% of the counties in the United States did not experience one death by gun. That defies the argument that it's epidemic. It's not an epidemic. What it is targeted. We know exactly where the preponderance of the crime occurs. It occurs in inner cities. Now, there are structural problems we have that we need to address on community levels, both state and local communities. We need to address it in these communities. We know where the crime is, but we need to address it on the local level. It's not something we do on the federal level. We can help fund it, but we need to address it where the problem occurs. Now, again, back to the mental health issue, because this is important. We know who are the people at most risk, and we're doing nothing to address that aspect of it. Mental health needs to be focused upon to protect all of us.
So I would caution us, I think we've talked about suicide, and clearly for lots of reasons there is need for more mental health services. There's no question about that, and there's effort afoot. But I think we need to be very careful, and again, because we don't necessarily have the data. If we were to provide mental health for everybody, would that indeed result in a significant decrease in firearm discharge deaths? And we don't know the answer. Why? Because we don't have the research. But I would caution you that that's probably not the entire answer, and it may only have a minimal impact, because when you poll the general public, we tend to believe that mental health and violence are connected. And that's just not true. And I think my colleague here on my left would agree. We overestimate violence in people with mental health issues, and therefore we overestimate the potential impact.
And in both cases, so in cases of where mental health is an issue and like suicides, and in cases in which it's violence, in both cases, means restriction is key. So you do deal with mental health, and you also deal with restricting access to the means. And I should say, I agree that in cases of other violence, you know what the biggest predictor is? Anger. Everybody has anger. Everybody experiences anger, and many people lose impulse control when they're angry. So therefore, having a knife is less likely to kill 20 of you than having a gun. And that is the reason to people and make it harder for people to just have ready access. There is no reason. You can protect yourself with a handgun. You don't need an assault weapon to protect yourself.
Thank you. We're going to have the last question from the audience, and then the Garfield Committee will convene, and I've got one closing question for you from me.
My name is Charlie Bean, and finally you're beginning to touch on the real issue that needs to be addressed on all of these things. These problems can be solved, but not in the short term. And why is it that we can't get the funding that we need instead of gutting all the mental health programs in the country? Why can't we get the funding? We spend less money on education in our country than 17 other countries in the world.
Thank you.
I can give you a clear answer. You may disagree, you might disagree. And that is because a certain element of society is focusing on one issue of the problem of gun death in America, and that is people focusing on taking away our guns. Think about if the energy against this gun movement, against guns in this country, actually focused on mental health research and dollars to solve mental health problems in this country. For the last 30 years, instead of trying to steal guns and confiscate guns from legal, law-abiding citizens. And keep in mind how few of these gun owners we have. Amazing number. Think of Switzerland. Think of Israel. They both have higher gun ownership rates than we do in America, but they don't have our problems. There's a lot of reasons why, but it's not because of the gun.
Question is stigma. Stigma. We have a huge stigma against mental health in this society. And we saw it with the addiction issue. Has a responsibility to deal with stigma, because stigma is something that is accentuated and perpetuated by our daily actions. If we want to get rid of stigma in terms of mental health, then it starts with each of us, and then it has to percolate up to our local governments, state governments, and federal governments, but it starts with each.
I would say that one of the reasons is because we don't want to spend money to help other people. That's why we gut our mental health system. So the same people who don't want to regulate guns and blame it on mental health are the people who don't want to pay for people's health care. And so that irony and that hypocrisy is really what's stopping a lot of the help. By the way, I'm not sure what resources, at least at the federal level, are being spent on gun control, because not one gun control legislation has been passed for 20 years. So there has been every discussion, even debate on gun violence has been quashed. So I have no idea where all these resources are being spent on gun control.
I'm sorry. Maybe I confused you. I was referring better. What my point was the movement to restrict guns, not federal spending, the spending we as citizens have spent effort-wise to restrict guns. If that was spent towards trying to lobby our members of the state house, state senate, our federal government to increase funding on health care issues, we might have seen better solutions.
Thank you. Y'all have asked some amazing questions today. Would you give yourselves a round of applause? My closing question might be a little tough, but I think it's worth us going through this exercise. I want to start, you're obviously here today. You came in response to this topic, but would you raise your hand if you think from what the status quo is right now? Okay. Of any sort, on any of the topics that we've touched on. Okay. I don't know if this is a statistically valid sampling, probably not. But clearly with the engagement that has gone on here, that's representative of the engagement that's gone on in our communities, in our state, in our nation, there's room for some kind of evolution from where we are today on some topic. I would say that y'all were invited because you're passionate, you're articulate about you, and you come from a position of expertise. I would ask you to extend that a little bit to be in a leadership position. If this army of very engaged folks was going to rely on you to figure out something that we could do as a community, as individuals, as the collective, and that would meet in the middle, where you see the need for balanced with the cost of society, balanced with safety for our families, and so on. If you could balance all of that as leaders and come out with one thing from your perspective that you could charge this group with going to help to implement, what would that be? I get the Garfield Committee.
So I would ask you to create a vision of what you want your community to look like, and then figure out, based on where we are today, what is it going to take to realize that vision? Because if we don't know where we're going, then as has been said before, any road will take us there.
Do you have I'm looking for yes.
So
I want to know that you heard him. We can't stay separated in this. We've got to come with some actionable middle ground that we can find resolve on. Yeah. And that's what I'm looking for.
So when we dealt with the automobile issue, I said we dealt with the person, the agent, and the environment. I want us to focus on all three. I want us to make change so that we help people. That may be mental health. That may be suicide prevention. I want us to look at gun technology and how we can have safer guns and what we need to do about the gun itself, and there may be some limitation issues there too. And then I want us to look at the environment that the guns are being used or that guns are felt to be needed and see what we can do to change it. We need to work in all three, and we need to do it together.
Thank you.
So I think it's middle, and I've worked with gun violence prevention organizations that are quite diverse. And honestly, if you look at surveys and when people are asked about specific types of regulations, the majority of people agree. So there is no necessarily like we need to meet in the middle. There is a middle we've already met. And I think there's a few in the minority who are opposing that. But most people, 80% of gun owners, 87% of gun owners are for comprehensive background checks at the federal level. And they are for red flag laws. Now, sometimes certain groups ask the questions in the wrong way. And they'll ask them, are you for taking away guns? Of course, people are going to say no if they're gun owners. But when you ask the question in a behavioral